Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenforth, and Redbridge's Cos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture and ideas. G'day. Welcome back, Curtinesters, to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast of politics, culture and ideas. It's just me on my lonesome today. Kung Fu Cos Samaras is away. We're joined by a terrific guest. Spring is in the air. Football finals fever is in the air. And this is also the time of year when many great books hit bookshops across the nation just in time for Christmas to stuff Christmas stockings or Hanukkah presents or Christmas, whatever you're celebrating. There's a book for you, and we have got the author of a terrific new book, A Fair Day's Work, The Quest to Win Back Time, Professor Sean Scalmer. Sean is a professor of history at Melbourne University. He's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. He has a very long and distinguished track record of researching the history of social movements and democracy and the labour movement in Australia and elsewhere, bringing to bear a study of the national history of Australia, but also transnational and comparative histories. He is the author of 7 books, unless you can correct me in a moment's time, including the prize-winning On the Stump, Gandhi in the West, Dissent Events, and The Little History of Australian Unionism. He's someone that I looked up to as I was beginning my studies in labour movement history. Sean Scalmer, welcome to Curtin's Cast.
Oh, thanks so much, Nick. It's great to be here.
It's wonderful to have you here. A Fair Day's Work, The Quest to Win Back Time. Before we jump into the book, I think our listeners might like to know a little bit more about you. As I mentioned before, you were someone that I looked up to. We're not going to debate the merits of Marxism and cultural materialism and post-structuralism today, Sean.
It's a relief.
I think it's a big relief to our listeners. How did you come to the study of labour history? Were there any labour historians in the family or labour movement activism?
No labour historians and not any sort of celebrated activists. But yeah, I come from a family where some of my first memories are moments of labour history. So I remember as a very young person my parents' anger at the dismissal. My grandmother, with whom I lived as a young person, she grew up in Jack Lang in New South Wales electorate, and her father was a Langite, and she would tell me stories of Jack Lang and what a great figure he was.
Greater than Lennon.
That's right. Although I later found out that he wasn't always so great, but at least in my nana's eyes he was. And yeah, my father was a truck driver. My mum was a typist, secretary. So I came from a working class background where people hadn't had the opportunity for formal education. So when I managed to get to university and to enjoy those possibilities, I naturally was interested in trying to understand inequality and the history of labour alongside other questions as well. So that incredible opportunity I had was something I grabbed and began to pursue.
Coming to the sort of book's themes, I'm assuming those kind of experiences, seeing your parents work and coming from working class background, obviously informed, drew you to labour history. But how have your experiences, as someone from a working class background going on to do a PhD? Some people have a funny idea of academics that we don't really work, but it can be a precarious existence. Now you're tenured, but that didn't happen overnight. So how has your experience of working in this field come to shape this project and the resulting book?
Yeah, well, I think maybe if I think about my experiences and how they shaped this particular project, it probably does start, as you suggested at the start of the question, with observing my parents at work, because obviously all of us grow into life being the subject of labour because, usually it's our mothers and our grandmothers, but also our fathers, depending upon our family circumstances, who are nurturing us, who are caring for us, who are doing that work, which to begin with, we don't always necessarily recognise as work. And then we're also conscious of when our parents go to work and what that means and how that takes them from us. So that they're always, strong memories for me. As I said, because my father was a truck driver, a really early memory is him announcing to the family that he's going to have to be away quite a bit, but when he comes back, we'll get a colour TV. So that notion of, long hours for economic reward or for consumption was something that as a young kid I remember thinking about. And then, of course, the arc of my family's life is that, my father, eventually lost a permanent job and, like so many people, went into more casual and precarious employment when he was older, when he was in his 60s. And that sense of, working longer hours and not being able to regulate those hours was very much something I saw through him. I also saw, again, one of the themes of the book is the struggle to reconcile and to balance work at home with work in the labour market. My mum, as she worked full-time, having to work at home, my grandmother's work to sort of keep the family going, and then my mother eventually stopping work for pay to care for my grandmother as she aged. So those kind of experiences were always part of it. And then, I'm sure they're common experiences of lots of listeners in their family trajectories. And for me, I'm father of two girls who are now in their teenagers. My wife pursues her own career, works full-time. And then that feeling especially when the kids are very young, that basically – how are we going to get through the week? If you want to be a good employee and do a good job, if you want to be a good partner and supportive of each other, if you want to be a good parent and spend time with your kids, it's very, very hard to do all those things at once. And you have a feeling that basically if nothing goes wrong, we'll get through the week. But of course, by the nature of things, something always goes wrong, and then the struggle to improvise. So yeah, definitely those experiences and that sense of the difficulty of balancing work and life were what led me to try and understand the history of these things. How is it that, and why is it that Australia was one of the leaders around the world of the campaign to win an 8-hour day, but then in the contemporary period, there was an OECD survey done quite recently which ranked Australia 8th last out of 38 member countries for a work-life balance. So our personal stories and experiences today reflect the fact that Australia doesn't have a good work-life balance, but we also have this memory, a justifiably heroic memory of being in the vanguard of winning rights for workers and winning time away from work. So what led me to the book, I guess, was trying to explore both of those things. How did we win those things? And then how did we lose our way to some extent?
You're right. Your book is fundamentally, it traces the monumentous achievement of an 8-hour day, the 40-hour working week. And I think it's fair to say that, we are approaching something of a crisis. Listeners, I've got a prop here which you can't see, but one of the big disruptors in terms of the family work-life balance is these little smartphones. My iPhone, it just went buzzing off as Sean was giving his answer, and there is a real blurring distinction between, when do you clock off? It's not like we clock on and we clock off. It's constantly there, and it's a struggle. And I think we have to be careful about talking about workers in a homogenous sense. There are some workers, I was going to say this might be a white-collar professional thing, but then if you're an Uber driver, if you're a delivery driver, the phone is part of your office setup as well. But let's come back to the big theme of the book. Tell us, Sean, this is a contested term. What is a fair day's work? I think you get lots of different answers.
Exactly, yeah. So in a way, the book is sort of exploring the fact that it is contested and what are the arguments that have been made about it as we've tried to define what fair is. Because everyone thinks that what they want is a fair day's work. Employers sometimes say they're granting a fair day's work, but that when we actually get to the nub of it, what does it mean? Well, I sort of look at it historically and actually say that over time, since the 19th century, there have been three kind of arguments about what makes a fair day's work. And the first of those arguments was really about the rights of waged workers in the 19th century. And it basically said, well, at the time in the middle of the 19th century, the average working week for a skilled tradesman was 60 hours a week. So they're working 10-hour days, 6 days a week. And they said, this is a violation of our human rights. And they actually talked about rights and they talked about their humanity. And they said, if you're to have a full human existence, you've got to do more than work, eat and sleep. They said a full human existence, you've got the experience of autonomy. You've got choices about what you're going to do. You're not just being commanded to do this and do that. They said if you're truly have a human existence, we've all got brains. We can all learn. We can all interact with the world and discover new things. Well, you're not going to be able to do that if you're too exhausted after work. They said if we're all human, we've all got the right to govern ourselves and to participate in that government. Again, you can't do that if you're working too long. And the final one that surprised me, that was so present in the 19th century, was actually these male unionists were saying, if you're human, well, you are part of families, you're part of communities, you've got friends, and you need time to be there in and around the home. So the first argument for a fair day's work was to say a fair day's work reflects the humanity of employees and gives them time to do all these things that are the richness of what it is to be human. And so we need to reduce our hours of work to 8 hours a day to allow us to do that. And that argument was really strong in the 19th century, but began to lose some force in the 20th century, and there was less discussion about the idea of the humanity of the worker. And a new kind of understanding of fairness became more important in some ways. And that was an understanding of fairness built around looking at productivity, technology, and the human body and fatigue. And that was the idea that, well, machines were coming in and changing the experience of labour, and they were often making work less pleasant. They were making it dirtier. They were making it noisier. They were meaning that workers couldn't decide the rhythms of their own work. They were being dictated by the rhythms of the machine. So that was all obviously not very good for workers. At the same time, employers were putting people out of work because these new machines were labour displacing. And so workers began to argue that there needs to be some kind of social trade-off, that a fair day's work will reflect the fact that if employers are getting all these benefits from new technology, employees need to get a benefit, and that benefit should be in reduced time at work. And equally tied to that was a new generation of social scientists and industrial sociologists and experts in health who actually looked at in detail at workers at work working with machines. And they found that because naturally people tire, as you work for longer hours, you become less efficient. And so therefore, if you actually reduce the working day and give people a chance to rest, they're going to be more productive and more effective. So the argument for a fair day's work in this period was that it was going to be fair to employers and to the economy as a whole, because the productivity gains would partly offset the benefits to workers as well. And then the final understanding of fairness that I explore in the book was actually present in some ways in the 19th century, but it really only takes off from the 1970s. And that's an idea of fairness which is trying to place work for pay in the context of household labour and caring work. And to say, if we're truly to have a fair day's work, we need to think about all the work that's being done, and we need to ensure that the work in the home is being fairly distributed. And if that obviously isn't happening right now, because we have very detailed studies which show that although formally we agree that men and women should play an equal role in raising their children, and there aren't the substantial formal barriers to women's involvement in the labour market, there's still a case that in practice for many families, it's a kind of a 1.5 earner model where the man who is more likely to have a higher income keeps working after the kids at full time after the kids are being born, and in fact often works longer hours because this is a pivotal time in forging a career. The mother is more likely to reduce her hours to work part-time for a period and to continue to play a bigger role in household labour. So the final arguments about fairness are about thinking about those things. And that one in particular is a standard of fairness that I think most people agree that we need to acknowledge those things, but actually in practice we haven't managed to find a way to do that.
Yes, I want to dig into this topic of the gender division of labour, which persists. It's interesting reflecting on how the meaning of fairness has been contested and shifted over time. Bringing your sort of comparative transnational analysis. I've been doing a lot of work on political culture and political language, coming back to my roots, my academic roots. And, again, I'm struck by Australia very much the big contested term, somewhat, in mateships, as a contested term, but fairness and the fair go is kind of the quintessential terrain, which is sort of contested, whereas you look at America and it's very much freedom. So whether it's, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, the linguistic contest, I hate that's a terrible academic phrase, but it's over freedom, whereas in Australia it's very, you might want to disagree with me here.
I very much agree.
But it's fairness.
Yeah.
And we would think, well, that's a naturally sort of left-wing or progressive term, but in fact, the political right has contested the meanings of fairness and contested the meaning of mateship.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I still think it's an achievement of the Labor movement to make fairness so central to public discussions. Yes. But as you say, once a term has that centrality in public discussions, everyone wants to claim it for their own purposes and to say, what I want is fair and what you want is unfair. Those, as you say, those battles go across history and are very important today.
Yes, but as you write, there is a disconnect between Australia's history and this momentous achievement of the 8-hour day and present understandings and present struggles. I was quite moved by, the opening part of your book where it's pretty much 160 years ago. It's April 23.
April 21,
April 21 marks the inauguration of the stonemasons winning the 8-hour day. And you talk about a commemoration in 2023, and there were sort of 30 brave souls who were there, and they marched from the State Library up towards Victorian Trades Hall. But 30 people, I mean, we had nutters out there yesterday, thousands of nutters out there yesterday on the streets, and we've had, thousands of people at anti-war demonstrations and the like. But we've had this momentous achievement where, again, Australia is at the vanguard of progress and democracy in its full meaning, which extends to industrial democracy of the workplace, yet there are only 30 people there commemorating this achievement in 2023. Why is that? A lot of people may not be aware of what actually took place in April of 1856. So tell us, Sean, about the 8-hour movement in Melbourne in the 1850s.
Yeah, I'd love to. And I guess in telling that story, we can also talk about how it's been remembered. 1856 is the big date in Melbourne. Melbournians were actually slightly late to the party. So it was actually in the middle 1850s more generally across the Australian colonies, there was a push to reduce hours that were predominantly around 60 hours a week for skilled workers. And it was actually in Sydney that the first breakthrough was made, where stonemasons on 2 work sites won an 8-hour day, although they won that with accepting reduced pay. And what happened in Melbourne at the beginning of 1856 was there were public meetings called by building workers with stonemasons in the vanguard, but with also a range of other building tradesmen, carpenters and plasterers and builders' labourers and so on, bricklayers and so on. And they had a meeting and they said, we want 8 hours work. And not only said we want it, they announced a date. They said on the 21st of April, we're going to work 8 hours a day only, and we're going to enforce our demands. And what happened is that through a process of public pressure and persuasion and the arguments that they put about the importance of rights and the things I've put to, most employers conceded, but some did not. And in particular, building contractors that were charged with building the Houses of Parliament, which was obviously a symbolically charged thing to be building, they said, no, we don't support the 8-hour day. And so what happened on the 21st of April was that, first of all, the stonemasons building Melbourne University up on the hill knocked off work and marched through the city, picking up at the major building sites on their way, ending up at Parliament House and demanding an 8-hour day across the industry. And that action won the 8-hour day across the industry. It was a very successful mobilisation. It was so successful that workers celebrated a couple of weeks later. About 1,200 trade unionists marched through the city, had a banquet with plum pudding and roast beef and music and fireworks into the night. And that then became the model for a celebration every year. And that celebration on the 21st of April every year became larger and larger. And I sort of think of it as almost like a kind of an advertisement for forming a union and winning these rights, because you could only march on that procession once you'd formed a union that had won the 8-hour day. And so from year to year, there was this sense of, well, were you part of a trade that had done this or not? And it was actually quite a slow process from those breakthroughs to 1856. I think there were 8 unions that won in 1856. Still at the end of the 1860s, there were only 12 unions or 13 unions in Melbourne that had the 8-hour day. But then over the 1870s and over the 1880s, more and more workers formed unions and managed to win the 8-hour day so that it became a generalised standard, although still some workers didn't have it.
Of course, the nature of unions are changed. You know, we're moving from the craft unions based on, you know, so stonemasons, etc., and we're moving towards industry-wide new unionism.
That's right. Yeah. Unions of unskilled workers, and that was important in particularly from the 1870s as workers used the political mechanisms to try and put pressure on parliaments. The key thing there was the way in which the Victorian governments in the early 1870s were pressured to make a policy that meant that if you had a contract with the government, you had to pursue and accept the 8-hour day. And that was used to ensure that navvies laying railway tracks won the 8-hour day, and that became the first step beyond the skilled workers. So that process of winning all those victories is always tied to a really strong memorial culture where workers are saying, this is an incredible thing that we've done, we're really proud of it. And I would suggest that actually the 8-hour marches that start off in Melbourne and later on they're in other places, they're Australia's first civic rituals really. You know, well before Empire Day or Anzac Day become, you know, mass events, they had over 100,000 people coming to line the streets in Melbourne to watch these 8-hour processions at their peak in the 1880s. And workers would march in their unions, they would display their skills, they would have huge sporting and cultural events at the end of them. And that sense that they were part of this culture that they wanted to nurture carries through all the way into the early 20th century, where they're building, you know, the 8-hour monument was raised up in 1903 opposite Trade. Now it's opposite Trades Hall. It was originally opposite Parliament House as a kind of a statement, like this is part of democracy. You know, we have won this. But of course, it happens with all mass movements is that over time, as the generation that's most closely fought for and won something, as they get old and die, those who follow them tend not to have the same, you know, close ties to these agendas. And so that the kind of memorial side of it became more, over time, I guess, somewhat of an empty ritual. And then you had other kinds of questions become important to the Labor movement. As Labor parties form, they obviously gain a lot of support, and the Labor Party's own kind of memorial culture starts to have its own kind of logic, which is detachable in some ways from the 8-hour and hours movements. Obviously, socialism becomes a big question, which draws many, but also divides some within the Labor movement. And so these older practices become increasingly marginalised. And then, of course, you know, the story, we're thinking about why so few people turn up. I think most people might know that we won the 8-hour day in 1856, but they don't know how it happened, or they don't think about other things like how did we win a weekend, which is such a massive achievement of the first part of the 20th century. People don't know about these things, so they're not wanting to mark them. They just sort of assume that they were handed down maybe. They don't realise the passionate struggle that lay behind them. And then the other thing, of course, is that the hours movement has lost much of its force. And so when there's not a live social movement pushing things forward, then the memory landscape gets lost as well.
Yeah, but at the time, working people and the unions were really proud of this achievement. Was there something specific to the political culture of Melbourne, Victoria? You've written quite a bit about colonial liberalism and its support for the aims and aspirations of the Labor movement. And how was this perceived beyond Australian shores? Australia was obviously held up as a social laboratory at the time, and New Zealand.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So how was it perceived globally? How did it...
We were, Victoria in particular, but Australia and New Zealand were held up as models internationally. Yeah. So the British Fabians were struggling to reduce hours in the 1890s, and they wrote a number of pamphlets about how an 8-hour day was possible, and they had whole chapters devoted to Australian history, and in particular the history of the Victorian movement, because it was the real pioneer that then, you know, encouraged movements in the other colonies. There was an Austrian economist in 1890 who wrote a whole book on the wages question and workers in Australia and New Zealand, which discussed at length what was happening in the Australian colonies.
I think the Austrian economists are part of the problem, which we're going to get to a little bit later.
Well, that's true, yeah. The French labour movement, even radical figures like Émile Pouget, who was sort of a leading syndicalist, he wrote in admiration in the early 20th century, at what Australian workers had achieved in winning reduced hours, because at the time French workers had very long hours, saying, well, here's a proof of what direct action can do. So, yeah, there was not only respect for what Australian workers had achieved, but actually a belief that Australian workers had offered lessons and Australian legislators offered lessons to other people around the world.
Yeah, and there's a famous Albert Matin, I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He came out to Australia to observe developments, and there was a very famous interaction with an Australian worker. Matin asked him, "What's your program?" And the Aussie worker responded, "My program, 10 bob a day." But it was obviously a bit more complex than that. So quite clearly, though, not everyone is working a 40-hour working week, are they? Yep. Women, we had the excellent Liam Byrne on a few weeks ago talking about the struggles of tailoresses who are not captured by many of these industrial laws. So it's not capturing, the 8-hour day is not capturing everyone, is it? So how did we get to the point where we actually have, even now I sign, my contract stipulates that I do 37 and a half hours. I don't do 37 and a half hours. I don't think you do, Sean. I don't think most workers do. How do we get to at least in principle, a 38-hour working week, and things like the weekend, a great labour movement union achievement, which I think you're right. People just assume that it's always been there, and it hasn't. I
think people folded into the 8-hour day. They think 1856, 8-hour day, that means an 8-hour day, 5 days a week. But as you say, it was a much longer struggle. Yeah, so basically the first part of the 20th century is a battle for a full weekend, and it really hots up from just after World War I. It's a really complex struggle because there are particular strongly organised unions that are able to win it for their members. First of all, they win a half-day holiday, they call it, so you knock off after working half a day on Saturday. So the sequence is that first of all, there's a struggle for a 44-hour week and then a 40. And yet it's some unions who win it through taking industrial action. But by this stage in the early 20th century, you have two things which, aid the labour movement. One, the most important, is the Labor Party, and the other is the establishment of Commonwealth courts of arbitration and state courts of arbitration, which set wages and conditions by judicial fiat. And that can often be not so good if the judge is not well disposed. But in Australia, the second president of the Commonwealth Court of Arbitration, a man called H.B. Higgins, he was a strong supporter of the labour movement with a very strong sense of social justice, and he started to make judgments to reduce hours, first of all, to 48 and then to 44. A notable judgment reduced it for timber workers, then for female textile workers and for engineers. So the way hours are being reduced in this early part of the 20th century is partly through union struggles, partly through these judgments. And then actually labour legislation, I think, plays a major role because, again, it's not, I think, widely remembered that remembering at the time that it's the states who have more capacity to legislate directly on hours of work and working conditions. So in New South Wales and in Queensland, state governments, Labor governments are elected and they legislate to make a 44-hour week. But there's huge opposition. So in New South Wales is the most complicated one. But so a Labor government introduces a 44-hour week as a standard for workers in that state. The Conservatives get in and remove it. Then Labor gets back in and reimposes it. Then the Conservatives get back in and remove it. And then Labor gets back in and establishes it. And it's only after that, very distended process go over more than a decade that workers in that state have a sense of a 44-hour week. A similar thing happens in Queensland, although it's only one reversal and reinstatement. So it's a very messy picture of winning the weekend. It's not like there's one moment because there's all these different things happening in different states with different unions. But the winning of the 40-hour week overall happens with a judgment of the Commonwealth Court of Arbitration at the end of 1947. and the judges award a 40-hour week for all workers as a common standard. But they do that in the context of Labor governments in New South Wales and in Queensland already having passed 40-hour legislation, the Commonwealth government saying they support a judgment of a 40-hour week, and also the ACTU threatening a general strike if the judgment is not 40-hour week, and saying not only will we have a general strike, workers, unionists will only work 40 hours no matter what anyway. And all those things lead the court to say, well, it's going to be actually very frank about it. They say, well, there's so much disruption. If we say no, there's already legislation here that sort of ties our hands more or less. So that gets to the 40-hour. And then to get to the 38, that's a huge struggle, which is a struggle for a 35-hour week that basically gets defeated. And then the kind of compromise in the early 80s is, okay, we'll go for a 38-hour week. Although, as you note, Nick, I think that's been more or less a meaningless, it's been a Pyrrhic victory, because what's happened is that in practice, the Australia Institute research last year said on average a full-time worker will work 4.1 hours of unpaid overtime every week. So formally we work a 38-hour week, but in reality we work, some of us work much more than that, and on average we're working more than 4 hours unpaid on top of that.
4 hours, about 40 hours here, Sean. You're kind of taking the story up to the 1980s. That's when many on the left say things went wrong just in general, not just and outside of the field of work, with the rise of neoliberalism and the marketisation of, almost every aspect of society. Where did things go wrong? Where did progress stall? Is it as simple as, Margaret Thatcher coming to power in 1979 and Ronald Reagan in 1980, and then, with the hard edges knocked off that with the Hawke-Keating Labor government in power federally in the 1980s? I'm assuming it's a longer story, and also that story doesn't capture the fact that, women entered the workforce in much greater numbers during World War II and afterwards, but they're quite clearly not doing a 38-hour working week, because they've got the dual burden, paid work and unpaid domestic labour.
Yeah, that's right. So as you say, it's again a complicated one with sort of intersecting forces. So if we think about why the campaign to reduce hours loses momentum overall, I go back to what are the key institutions that drove reductions in hours always? Well, it was a strong trade union movement. It was a Labor Party that was willing to legislate and take the lead on reduced hours. And it was Commonwealth Courts of Arbitration that were responsive to political and industrial pressure. And all those things shifted in various ways. We can argue about the extent to which they shifted, but, it was clear unions, union membership that was more than 1 in 2 workers at one stage is now around 1 in 8 workers. It's clear that, the Labor Party has not been willing to legislate because, it's about hours, because its overall view is that, market disciplines and flexibility for employers is important in order to build employment in the context of, from the 1980s, mass unemployment. Part of that, the powers of what was an Industrial Relations Commission or an Arbitration Commission were reduced to the Fair Work Commission, which just sets a very small set of conditions. Yeah,
and of course Victoria hands over its powers.
That's right, yeah. So the willingness of state governments to sort of experiment with advancing reduced working time and workers' interests around this were much reduced from the 1980s. Although, just as an aside, I think one of the things I take heart from personally is, what was announced at the last Victorian State Labor Party conference, which was that, a proposal to mandate a right to work from home 2 days a week. So that I see as a revival of a really valuable Labor tradition.
And it was a big issue at the last election. We're missing Kung Fu Kos today, but and Liberal polling has showed this as well. We spoke to Keith Holohan last week, and he said he talked about a sort of trifecta or holy trinity or unholy trinity of issues, and one of them was work from home. And as Kos has detailed, it was working women who were most alarmed at these sort of MAGA Elon Musk Trumpian-inspired calls to ban work from home, and with also the double-barreled threat of massive cuts to the public service, and people, basically said no.
Yep.
And so I think you're right. I mean, I think that was part of the zeitgeist is, no, hang on, like we actually quite like these arrangements, and it's allowing us to have a better work-life balance. So
absolutely. And I think one thing that I think is notable about taking this extra step is that I agree with you, the election demonstrated very clearly the mass support for these things, but the existing situation is still a right to request for some workers, and it's very hard for workers who aren't well organised or have coveted skills to be able to push the point. And obviously at the moment as well, that the Liberal Party had said that it was opposed to state employees, Commonwealth employees working from home. So it looms that unless something is on the books to buttress the rights of employees, they're vulnerable to being taken away. So that's one reason why I think this was such an important intervention. But if we were to go back to the broader issues about working time and gender, as you say, one of the massive social changes that has been so important over the last 40 years has been the greater entry of women into the labour market. So more and more women are working for pay, but at the same time, the industrial system, it continues to assume that a worker is going to be available for 40 hours a week or 38 hours a week, and to be able to jump to command at the same time as we know that the requirements of trying to care for others and to run a household make that extremely difficult thing to do. And so in practice, what's happened is that mostly it's been women who've accommodated their working lives around that situation and have reduced their hours and worked part-time for substantial periods in order to keep the show on the road for the family.
Which has a lot of flow-on effects.
Exactly.
In terms of the accumulation of superannuation, career progression.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's one of the key explanations of a gender pay gap. One of the things I'm trying to argue in the book, I don't sort of claim I'm the first to argue it, but I'm trying to put the history behind it, is that there needs to be some institutional structural changes, because in the absence of them, then we're basically saying we accept a society which is marked by these substantial inequalities.
Yeah, I want to come to the specific topic of the 4-day working week, which the ACTU have pitched up as part of the current debate around productivity. But just pausing for a moment, technology. We were told that technology, the internet, these damn smartphones were going to be a sort of form, we're going to liberate humans, but it hasn't quite panned out that way, has it? It seems to have tethered us ever more tightly to work, and a sense that we are always on. And as I mentioned before, it's not just white-collar professionals who have the privilege of being able to work from home. If you are if you're in a manual blue-collar or pink-collar working-class job, don't have that option. If you're a nurse or you're a teacher, you're on the tools, you don't have that particular form of privilege. So technology, how has it contributed to?
Yeah, I certainly agree with the broad point you're making, Nick. I would just slightly, I guess, finesse it, because I still think that if you go back to the 19th century, people were saying we want an 8-hour day, and then lots of businesses and employers were saying it's not possible for us in our business to have an 8-hour day. Yeah. Bakers were the big one. They have to work 13 hours a day, otherwise we're not going to make the bread. Well, the pressure to actually concede an 8-hour day meant that they found technological fixes and responses that made it possible. Similarly, I think it's the absence of pressure from below to reduce our hours has meant that a lot of businesses and employers have said, well, it's not practical to work from home or to do these other or to reduce hours, and there's nothing can be done about it. But of course there are limits. I'm not saying you can be a nurse at home the whole time, but many blue-collar and pink-collar jobs have elements of administrative work attached to them that can be done perhaps from home or can be done in other ways. So I do think that a broader social shift around these things would have benefits for all workers of all kinds. But as to technology, I think you've made a really powerful point that I always go back to, John Maynard Keynes, wrote this famous essay in 1930, I think it was, Economic Problems of Our Grandchildren, which basically said, well, we can expect about a 3-hour day, 15-hour working week, within a couple of generations, because technology will allow us to have it. And obviously that hasn't happened. As you said, it's almost been the opposite, that hours have got longer and technology's been used and applied in such a way that work is invading, for many of us, all of our lives. But again, that's where I do see some positive developments that, whether or not all workers get to use it is another question, but the right to disconnect was passed last year in legislation, which is designed precisely to meet this challenge and to say that, employees do have a right to switch off from work. And because if you don't switch off from your work and then you don't rest, and then the consequences for you and your family life, but again, also for your productivity, are really going to be profoundly bad.
I was thinking about, this sense of inevitability. It's almost about 120 years to the day where Andrew Fisher famously declared that we're all socialists now. And the only qualification was how much of a socialist you were. That seems to have stalled as well. And even social democracy seems to have stalled. But I think in the terms of the zeitgeist, I think, at the moment there's a big debate about productivity in this country. Treasurer Chalmers convened an economic reform roundtable here at the JCRC. We released our discussion paper on productivity, and at the centre of that was moving beyond this idea of productivity only being confined to labour productivity, because that's actually not the big problem in Australia. And we came up with some, what we think are new and interesting ideas to lift productivity rates. But for so long it has been conceived as squeezing more out of labour, increasing workloads rather than more fairly distributing time. And my sense is that, again, the political zeitgeist might suit the labour movement at this particular juncture. But if productivity is back at the centre of the economic debate, we need to be actively broadening out the context and the terms of the debate, and reintroducing, as I think you trace in the book, the moral and social dimensions of productivity, and thinking about, inadequate industrial laws. And that's what the Labor government's been moving that way. But, the stress and the health costs of overwork and the erosion of civic life and leisure and good quality family time.
Absolutely. And again, I go back to, some of the research from the book looked at the period around World War I, because this was a moment when internationally in the US and the UK especially, but also in parts of Europe, employers and governments are wanting to increase productivity as fast as they can, because basically they want to make munitions, armaments that they can bring to the front where they can kill more people and win the war. So there's a huge amount of research and focus on more production, more productivity. And what do they find in studies of munitions workers in Britain, but also studies in the United States? They find when workers work really long hours, their productivity falls, and when they actually reduced their hours, their productivity increased, because there's less absenteeism, there are less accidents, there's more cooperative effort about finding ways to do better things. And so as a result, there's a gain for everyone. And I think that lesson has been lost, really.
It's not rocket science, is it? Healthier workers that are less fatigued, they're going to be better workers.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that one thing I tried to do in the book was to recapture that history and to try and bring it back into public discussion, because as you say, it's not rocket science, and yet it seems to have been forgotten.
Now, public discussion, 4-day working week. Now, you've advanced this in the book, and a neat little snappy article for the Saturday paper. The ACTU have made the case at the economic reform table. Tell us about the 4-day work. Why do we need it? I'll play the devil's advocate here for a moment. Is it a realistic goal, or is it just a slogan?
Yeah, well, I think first of all we need it because we're currently working way too long, and we've already talked over the last however many minutes about the fact that in reality, workers today, employees today, are working more than they did in the early 1980s. So with all of the productivity, with all of the new technology, with all of the increased wealth in our society, and with all the growth of the labour market, with women working much more. At the same time, we're asked to work more, and we're also doing some of that work for free. On average, more than 4 hours of work for free for our employers as unpaid overtime. So, some campaign, something needs to happen to shift that. And we've also discussed the fact that reduced hours will have productivity gains because it's going to allow for reduced absenteeism, for better health, for less accidents, and for greater cooperative effort. We're living in a moment of great technological change where, in particular, it's emphasised that AI is going to change our workplaces. It's going to lead to all these greater efficiencies, apparently. Well, again, I look back to history and I look back to Justice Higgins of the arbitration courts in the early 1920s, where he says, if workers are to accept new technology and to not stand up against it, which is going to be great for employers and good for the economy, then they need something in return. So if artificial intelligence is to change white-collar work and pink-collar work and all forms of work, then really it behoves us to think about a social arrangement where there is some payoff. A 4-day week, I think, is more than a slogan because, there are many, many trials around the world which look at this and test it. There is an organisation, 4-Day Week Global, that's become the kind of NGO that's driving discussion. It's done or supervised trials of a 4-day week in more than 100 workplaces and businesses. And, it finds very positive outcomes, in particular for worker health. There are other studies of particular workplaces which show that there is increased productivity. Of course, I don't think anyone is saying that there should be, in the manner of Jack Lang passing a 44-hour week legislation, tomorrow a government should pass 4-day week legislation. But I think what we need to recapture is the sense of experiment, because this is what actually drove reductions in hours from the 19th century, was groups of workers or sometimes employers working with them to cooperate on new arrangements that reduced working time and to see what the impact will be, and to measure it and to find a way forward. And I think we've lost that because there's just been this culture of people need to work in order to keep their job. So I think the 4-day week is more than a slogan because it's been trialled, but I think it's also a useful way of thinking about trials and experiments that can try and think about hours in more creative ways.
Part of the challenge is de-abstracting. Perhaps they just invented a new word, but removing the abstraction from this and coming back to that central, the 8-hour day slogan: 8 hours labour, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. And so as part of making the case for a 4-day working week, making it less abstract, can I finish on a personal note? How would 4-day working week alter your work-life balance?
Yeah, well, that's a great and challenging question. I'm going to throw it back at you to end on that one. Well, I would say that, I have substantial flexibility in my work compared to most because I work in a university where my face-to-face hours are limited, but my working time is quite wide. But what it would allow me to do is, to ensure that I'm there for my children, when needed, without it being always the subject of detailed negotiation. It would allow me to perhaps to play a greater role as my parents age in caring for them. I think that's probably the other aspect, is that we tend to think about care, and I've spoken mostly about care for children, but with the ageing of the population, it's going to be care for elders. It's going to be a major thing. And if children are able to work 4 days a week, their capacity to play a active role in caring for their parents as they age, and perhaps keeping them out of aged care homes and so on by working together, that can be a profoundly important thing to do with our lives alongside our work.
That's something, you can put it back. That's something I'm grappling at the moment. My parents are approaching their mid-80s. Mum's not really well at the moment. I'm having to take time off to help with the current treatment at the moment, but that just means that later on, so Thursday's the day, and then later on Thursday I'm making up the hours.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that's the main thing, is that it would, I think, liberate us from that burden of having to always be making up hours by working late into the night, or working on weekends and odd moments in order to do the things that we need to do to be good friends, good family members, and good employees.
Good citizens.
Yeah, and good citizens.
I think that's the other critical thing is we have withdrawn from civil society. We're not joiners. Whether we can go back to the time where people had the time to form early closing associations. Whether we can recapture that is a moot point. But if people have an extra day, then
absolutely. I think that's a very powerful message that, this problem that we have where we don't volunteer anywhere near as much as we want. I don't think it's a moral failure that somehow this generation, is less caring than others, but it's the time pressures have meant that that's been the thing to go. And if we were to win time away from work, then that opens up much more capacity to pursue hobbies, to be involved in sporting and cultural organisations and in organisations that make a broader contribution to society.
Just finally, Cos and I have spoken a lot about the rising political and electoral power of millennials plus Gen Z. Cos keeps making the point that they outnumbered boomers at the recent election, which explains a lot of what went on and how we've seen a dramatic change from 2019 to 2025, and at the next election in 2028, they'll make up over 50% of the electoral rolls. So if you had a message for particularly Gen Z as to, why they should be paying attention and what it means to them, what would it be? It
would be that we know that these generations are less attracted to the idea of a full-time career job. And are wanting to, what's called quiet quitting or to take gap years or to work part-time instead of full-time. Those improvisations are really the product of the fact that a full-time career is hard to win and that the hours of work are so long. So in a sense, they're finding individual improvisations to deal with the pressures, social pressures we're talking about. So I'd say to them, if you got involved in collective campaigns to actually change the system, to change the structure of work, that would allow you to pursue your enthusiasms and not to feel dominated by work at the same time as you could have hopefully good and rewarding careers. I think that's a message for all of us.
It is good advice for Gen Zs and any generation. And join a union. I think that's good. There is strength in union. There's dignity in collective struggle. Sean Scalmer, thank you very much. Curtinistas, you must go out and buy Sean's book, A Fair Day's Work, The Quest to Win Back Time, which is out now through Melbourne University Publishing. Sean, now's your time to spruik the book launch. The book launch is happening.
Yes, September 16 at Victorian Trades Hall, Solidarity Hall at 6 p.m. And it's being launched by ACTU President Michelle O'Neill. And we also have two union leaders from the ASU and the Nurses and Midwives Federation. So it's not just a celebration of the book coming out. It's actually meant to be a point of discussion about how we move from an 8-hour day to a 4-day week.
Campaign tool. We'll put a link in the podcast so you can sign up and attend Sean's launch. Sean, again, thank you very much. Head to the Melbourne University Publishing website to buy A Fair Day's Work and all good bookshops, including Readings, which I think is a unionised shop. But for now, that's all. Ciao and arrivederci.